welcome to the Center for Research on Vermont's Research in Progress seminar. Tonight, we're very pleased to have with us, in addition to a number of distinguished guests in the audience, we have with us this evening Sylvia Bugbee and Selena Colburn, who are both from the University of Vermont's Bailey Howe Library. Sylvia Bugbee is a collections specialist and assistant archivist in special collections. A lot of us, of course, already know that because we've gone running to her with some kind of research dilemma on numerous occasions. Sylvia has worked on a wide variety of archival projects over the years, many of which involved women's history. Most recently, she made quite a splash with her edited collection, An Officer and a Lady, the World War II Letters of Colonel Betty Bandel, which has received a lot of attention, a lot of favorable press around here. Selena Colburn has last year become Special Assistant to the Dean of Libraries for Outreach, Development, and Planning. Before that, she worked with the archival collections at WGBH Educational Foundation in Boston, at the Shelburne Museum, and the University of Vermont Archives, and she served as the archivist for the Consuelo Northrop Bailey papers. Selena's been working most recently on a grant proposal for a project documenting Vermont women's political contributions, a project which I think is related to the one you'll hear about tonight. So tonight, Sylvia and Selena will speak about the life and work of Consuelo Northrop Bailey, and in a more general way about the story of Vermont women in politics. It goes without saying with both of these scholars that their work is deeply rooted in the archives, and I think it would be safe to say that what we have here with us tonight, Sylvia and Selena, are really unrivaled in the depth of their familiarity with the archives on Vermont women in politics. So we're especially pleased to welcome them here this evening.
Hi, I'm Selena, not Sylvia. And before I forget, I want to tell everyone that you can take a free door prize of Consuelo Northrop Bailey's autobiography, Leaves Before the Wind, with you tonight. They're on the table back there, and feel free to help yourself. So 50 years ago, the trailblazing Consuelo Northrop Bailey was sworn in as the nation's first elected female lieutenant governor. Bailey was a Vermont native, born in Fairfield, who played an extraordinary role in Vermont's political landscape over a period of about 50 years. She remained active in local and national Republican Party politics until her death in 1976. My colleague Sylvia Bugbee will be speaking about Consuelo and her archival papers in greater detail. I'm going to set the stage by talking about the broader story of Vermont women in politics and government and the way this story is documented in historical records. You'll note that I'm not a historian myself, so throughout my talk what I'll mostly be doing is suggesting possible avenues of research, which I hope will interest some of you real historians, political scientists, and other scholars in the audience tonight. And I'm looking forward to some lively discussion, and I hope that we'll have lots of time for questions and suggestions and to hear some of your thoughts about this really fascinating subject. When Gay Symington was sworn in last month as Speaker of the House, she was only the second woman in the state's history to hold this position. The first was, of course, Consuelo Northrop Bailey. Symington and her predecessors' experience in the state legislature are part of a remarkable story. Vermont has sent more women to its state legislature than any of the United States save New Hampshire, whose 400-member House of Representatives is by far the largest in the nation. Support for women's political rights came early in Vermont, with notable advances in the struggle for suffrage. In 1880, tax-paying women were given the right to vote and hold office in school districts. In 1917, Vermont became the first New England state to pass a municipal suffrage bill. Governor Percival Clement resisted public and Republican Party support for women's right to vote when he neglected to sign a presidential suffrage bill and refused to call a special session of legislators to ratify the 19th Amendment, leaving Vermont to cede passage to the necessary 36 states. Suffrage was granted at the federal level in August of 1920. In Vermont, it didn't take long to reach the next milestone, women as public office holders. Orange's Edna Beard was the first woman elected to the State House of Representatives, occupying seat number 145 in 1921. At the time, one newspaper reported, For a long time, no mere man had the courage to select seat number 146, which adjoins her. Her first piece of legislation provided child care support for women whose husbands were unable to work due to health conditions. Beard went on to successfully run for state senate in the following election and became the first woman elected to that body as well, leaving 4 women behind her in the House. The subsequent phenomenon of women's election in large numbers to the state legislature prompted a Life magazine article in 1953, documenting the sensation and proclaiming, "Vermont ladies are taking over." At the time, Vermont boasted the largest number of women in the state legislature in the U.S., 2 in the Senate and 52 in the House. With Consuelo Northrop Bailey serving as Speaker of the House, the situation was certainly an oddity and was treated as such. Life stated, "The mores of Vermont's old state house seem changed forever. Each morning the halls blossom afresh with flowers for the lady speaker. Business is interrupted to give blushing female lawmakers birthday corsages. Visiting infants sometimes crawl about the floors, and the time-honored legislative cuspidors are mostly hidden." By contrast, the magazine described men finding relaxation and meager comfort in their card room, which, equipped with spittoons and cribbage boards, is almost their last refuge. No one has done a comprehensive comparative analysis of Vermont's women legislators, a worthy endeavor perhaps for someone in the audience here tonight. But I believe that if we were to do that, what we would find is that though New Hampshire has sent more women in numbers, Vermont holds the overall record for percentage in the state legislature. So through data maintained by the Center for American Women in Politics, the National Conference for State Legislatures, and Elizabeth Cox's Women, State, and Territorial Legislators, 1895 to 1995, I've gathered just some numbers and statistics that demonstrate Vermont's uniqueness in this regard. In 1925, there were 11 women in the Vermont House, and women constituted approximately 4% of the state legislature. Within 20 years, there were 47 female representatives, with women comprising 17% of the state legislature. And throughout the 1970s, women continued to make up over 10%. Comparatively, women accounted for less than 5% of state legislators nationally until 1973. Statistics gathered by the Center for American Women in Politics from 1979 to 2000 demonstrate that women constituted between about 18 and 34% of the Vermont House and Senate, often ranking it among the top 5 states in the nation in this regard. This year finds Vermont at the top of the class again, trailing behind only Colorado, Maryland, and Delaware. Prior to 1965, the Vermont House was made up of a single representative from each town, regardless of population, with a total of 246 members. This is one of the reasons often cited for women's strong political presence in the House. In 1962, a U.S. Supreme Court decision dictated that Vermont's House must be reconfigured more democratically based on population. So in 1965, the so-called suicide legislature created a new 150-member House with reapportioned districts. While the number of women in the legislature declined briefly, percentages stayed competitive with the rest of the country and steadily rose back up. The Republican Party dominated Vermont politics for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, winning all statewide elections between 1854 and 1958. In fact, the strength of the Republican Party is another of the hypothesized reasons for women's extraordinary gains. The National Republican Party actively supported women's rights platforms, only beginning to shift their position in the 1970s. This trend is well documented in Melanie Gustafson's Women and the Republican Party, 1854 to 1924, and Vermont's history provides rich territory for further investigation of this relationship. In much of Vermont throughout the 20th century, a woman Republican was more likely to get elected than a male Democrat. In her 2002 doctoral dissertation, Karen Madden stated, "The experiences of politically engaged Vermont women suggest that the situation in Vermont provided political openings for women that were not available in larger, more industrial states with strong two-party systems. Vermont's small geographic area, limited population, agricultural economy, the Republican stranglehold on state and local politics, and the fact that from 1920 to 1965, every town in Vermont sent a representative to the legislature each year, regardless of the town's population, created more political opportunities for women in the state, despite the obstacles that gender discrimination put them before that gender discrimination put before them. Madden's dissertation is a comparative study of suffrage and Republican Party politics in Vermont and Michigan, and is one of the few scholarly works to investigate the phenomenon of women's political contributions in the state. That's my daughter. That's my new daughter. She wants more scholarly work on this subject. Women also rose to positions of power within the Democratic and Progressive parties, even without being elected to public office with as much frequency as their Republican counterparts. Esther Sorrell is often described as the godmother of Vermont's Democratic Party for her behind-the-scenes roles campaigning and strategizing long before the Democrats took hold. Both Howard Dean and Madeleine Kunin have described Sorrell as a mentor. In Winning Back America, Dean writes, Esther Sorrell was truly the mother of the Democratic Party in Vermont. The party had a somewhat anemic history in the state, but there was nothing anemic about Esther. In 1958, the governor's race was very close, and the Democrats lost only after a recount. The county chairman called in Esther and a group of women who'd worked on the campaign and said, "Girls, you worked really hard. How about we give you a party?" And Esther said, "How about you give us some seats on the county committee," which at that time was an all-male group. Sorrell went on to serve several terms in the state legislature. The gradual ascendancy of the Democratic Party contributed to the political career of Madeleine Kunin and very much vice versa, and we're honored to have Governor Kunin here tonight. She was born in Zurich, Switzerland, and immigrated to the United States in 1940, escaping the Hitler regime with her widowed mother and 10-year-old brother. After receiving degrees in history and journalism, she moved to Burlington to work for the Free Press as an education reporter. In 1971, Kunin, a professor and mother of four, was elected to the Vermont House as a Democrat representing a Burlington district. She served 2 3-year terms and became minority whip in 1974. In 1978, she was elected lieutenant governor of Vermont, the first woman after Consuelo Bailey to hold this office, and served 2 terms. She ran for governor in 1982, losing to Republican Richard Snelling. She ran again in 1984 and won, becoming the 4th woman governor in the nation and the first in Vermont. She was the first woman in the country to serve 3 consecutive terms in this office. Madeleine Kunin elected not to run for governor in 1992, and Bill Clinton named her as U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education in his new administration. In 1996, she was appointed ambassador to Switzerland. Kunin founded the Institute for Sustainable Communities to work on environmental issues in Central Europe. While her career mirrors Consuelo Bailey's to a point, she has gone on to much greater success in national and international arenas. She's also been more willing to reflect on her role as a woman political leader, particularly in retrospect. In her autobiography, she writes, "My womanhood and its relationship to my capacity to govern were the central issues of my political life. But I had kept them hidden, sometimes even from myself, and more frequently from public view. In order to govern, I had to behave as if being a woman was not an issue, because otherwise the woman thing would take on monstrous proportions and devour whatever else I hoped to accomplish. I couldn't have afforded to expend the emotional energy required to analyze the huge number of subtle but frequent gender questions, which would have either weakened my capacity to govern or given it fresh resolve." Many have speculated on what would have happened if Consuelo Bailey had opted to run for governor. Publicly, she cited the ill health of her husband, but subsequent accounts and Bailey's own correspondence make it clear that the Republican Party doubted whether or not Vermonters would choose to elect a woman and were not willing to forfeit their own hold on the office of governor for the experiment. To what extent does a glass ceiling still exist for Vermont women? While there has been tremendous success at the local level, our state is one of only 5 in the nation that have never sent a woman to the U.S. House or Senate. The others are Delaware, Iowa, Mississippi, and New Hampshire. Interestingly, Delaware and New Hampshire are states that also have strong participation by women in state legislatures. Might some of the factors that support strong leadership locally serve as impediments at the national level? Vermont women have also played instrumental roles in the social justice movement and in third-party politics. With less pressure around electoral politics, were women freed to take on more prominent leadership positions? Helen Mcmartin was one of several women who led the Vermont Progressive Party from its formation in 1948 until its demise in 1955. A recent study on the significance of the 1948 presidential election erroneously concluded that McMartin died in 1951, exhausted by the failures of the Henry Wallace campaign. In fact, she lived until 1987 and was a leader in the local and international peace movement. And I'm indebted to a researcher from Rutgers who passed that story along to me. But she was a leader in the local and international peace movement, exemplifying many progressive women's experience transitioning from the political organizing of the mid-20th century to the grassroots movements of the 1960s and 70s. Archival collections held around the state of Vermont are resources waiting to be tapped for research on these topics. The University of Vermont Special Collections houses the personal papers of Consuelo Northrop Bailey, Madeleine Kunin, Helen Mcmartin, multiple state legislators, social activists, and the records of the League of Women Voters. UVM's collections of congressional papers and other political materials round out the picture. The Vermont State Archives houses records of individual legislators, the Vermont Women's Legislative Caucus, formerly the Order of Women Legislators, or OWLs, the Vermont Commission on Women, and Madeleine Kunin's gubernatorial records. The Vermont Historical Society holds related personal and organizational papers, including papers of Helen Mcmartin, which complement those held at UVM, and Ellen David Friedman, reflecting two different incarnations of the Progressive Party. So I hope what you're starting to see is that no single collection, archival collection, tells the whole story here. Women as different in political persuasion as Consuelo Northrop Bailey and the longtime social activist Martha Kennedy, whose philosophy was grounded in the Quaker tradition of pacifism, and who someone told me just passed away in the past week, were both active participants in the League for Women Voters. What common issues, if any, did they mobilize around, and why? How did Sadie White, a former Democratic legislator who served on the city council in Burlington during Bernie Sanders' tenure as mayor, influence public policy and bridge the Democratic and progressive parties? How might her insights have shaped Sanders' own developing political identity? A researcher could also compare the campaign speeches and strategies of Consuelo Bailey and Madeleine Kunin. How did each woman make reference to her gender? Was it a topic to be trumpeted, avoided, or sidestepped? While personal papers emphasize the individual's political achievements, many also document aspects of their personal life and other positions held. And this, I think, provides for a really unique insight, allowing the researcher to see the full context that led women to quote Governor Kunin, live a political life. Often such collections document an individual entering the political arena at the grassroots level, then going on to more prominent positions. In addition to telling the story of Vermont women's political contributions, these archival collections also serve as resources for the study of social history, rural history, the Democratic and Republican parties, third-party politics, peace and social justice movements, and national political history. So if it sounds like I'm making the case for increased preservation and access to these collections, I am, of course. UVM currently has a proposal pending with the National Endowment for the Humanities to work collaboratively with the Vermont State Archives and the Vermont Historical Society. If funded, project staff would organize and preserve archival collections, eventually making selected materials available on the web as part of Special Collections digital library efforts. But access to these materials should not rely on outside funding. So I'm going to urge all of you to kind of create a demand, because demand will help to ensure that women's political collections remain a priority. So start requesting use of these materials for your own research and send your students into special collections. And I'm kind of allowed to flood the market there because my husband is the manuscripts curator in special collections, so I won't get in trouble for sending you there. Or maybe I will, but I can take it. The Vermont archival community's women's political collections may shed light on many questions. To what extent and on what issues have Vermont women voters affected public policy? How have women managed to impact political agenda outside of electoral politics, for example, through peace and social justice movements? Did the advances made by women in Vermont influence the rest of the nation? How did the experience of Vermont women compare to those in other localities? To what extent do these experiences represent those of the nation as a whole? How did Vermont women's experiences compare across different political parties? Did women's increasing involvement in politics play a role in the emergence of the Democratic and Progressive parties as political forces to be reckoned with in Vermont? What has prevented Vermont from electing a woman to the U.S. House or Senate, despite the relative power women have wielded at the local and state level? Are women in public office drawn to or sidelined to particular issues? In A Room at a Time, How Women Entered Public Politics, Joe Freeman writes, "The national politic is not where most political activity occurs. Politics is local. Political parties are mostly concerned with state and local elections. Committees exist at every level. Clubs are organized around local units. Workers spend most of their time in their communities. And most public policy, particularly that affecting women more than men, is made by state legislatures. Consequently, the study of women in politics is the study of grassroots political activity. Only after many local studies have been written will the building blocks exist to construct a solid edifice." So I hope that our talk tonight will interest some of you in creating those building blocks. And I guess on that note, I'll just urge you one more time to take your free copy of Leaves Before the Wind, and I'll turn things over to Sylvia Bugbee, who will delve into much greater detail about one specific and very fascinating collection, Consuelo Bailey's. Thank you.
Tonight to celebrate and commemorate the remarkable life of Consuelo Northrop Bailey, who 50 years ago was sworn in as the first elected woman lieutenant governor in the country. I'm going to be presenting you with a brief pocket summary of her life and times and offering some of my own insights made while I was working on arranging her papers. I too was a Consuelo Bailey archivist, so which, as you've heard, are in special collections. And I see that there are people in the audience tonight who I trust, in fact I insist, will contribute their own memories of Consuelo Bailey and her times and offer their insights into her career. I welcome comments from you who are here this evening about her place in Vermont history, the history of Vermont government during her career, and the development of women in leadership roles. Bailey's election as lieutenant governor was not the only nor the first of her firsts. In 1926, she was elected the first woman state's attorney in Vermont. And in that capacity, she was the first woman to try a murder case in the state. She was the first Vermont woman to be admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. An influential force in the National Republican Party, she was a Republican National Committee woman from 1936 to 1975. And in 1953, Bailey was elected as the first woman Speaker of the Vermont House. And as Selina said, still the only Speaker until Gay Symington was elected to that post this year. I'm trying. The Northrop family had its roots in the small town of Sheldon in northwestern Vermont. Bailey's father, Peter Bent Brigham Northrop, stayed on his family farm while Consuelo's mother, a former school teacher, Catherine Fletcher, moved to St. Albans and then to Burlington with her 3 girls in order that they would be educated in good schools. After graduation from UVM in 1921, Bailey taught high school Latin and American history in Shelburne for a year before entering Boston University School of Law in 1922. She came back to Burlington in 1925 and took her Vermont bar exam. And when attorney Pearlie Feen resigned from his office as a city grand juror, which was the prosecuting attorney for the city of Burlington, she was appointed in that position. The post of grand juror probably helped Bailey win her first elected public office as a state's attorney in 1926. She was very close to and revered her father, who was an important influence in her life, and her decision to study law was influenced by the fact that he had been unable to study for the law, and she, I think, took it upon herself to, after his early death, to follow in his footsteps and carry on his hopes and traditions. In 1941, she married Henry A. Bailey, a fellow member of the State Republican Committee, first mayor of the newly organized town of Winooski, and a fellow lawyer as well. They established the law practice of Bailey and Bailey, and both continued as very active participants in Vermont Republican politics. But in 1944, H.A. Bailey was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and very soon was bedridden. Consuelo Bailey continued the law practice and her active political life, but his illness would cast a long shadow over her life and political career. How do we fit Consuelo Bailey's achievements into the political environment of her times? Her most visible political career spanned the 1950s, a time when expectations for women were supposed to have been marriage, domesticity, conformity. The myth of post-war America as a land of contented housewives in the new suburbia. In reality, however, the 1950s saw a major increase in the number of women in political office, both in the state and nationally. Bailey's accomplishments in that respect fit into her times. Contrary to the stereotypic view of life in the 50s, women post-World War II were making their presence known in public life. But there are few women whose professional careers span so many decades, and Bailey was the most visible and recognized woman in Vermont politics in her day. I remember personally, as a child growing up in Vermont, everyone, all of the school children knew about Consuelo Northrop Bailey. It was kind of like a mantra, Consuelo Northrop Bailey, sort of like Edna St. Vincent Millay. But, you know, she was very well known in her day. During her career in state politics, she earned her dues in the party pretty much from the local organization on up. Very active in the Chittenden County and state Republican committees, her first elected office was as state senator from Chittenden County in 1926. During the 1930s, she took on the position of executive secretary with U.S. Senator Ernest W. Gibson Sr. Professional women of today might look askance at the thought of an experienced lawyer with the beginnings of a political career already under her belt taking on such a job. But Bailey undoubtedly saw it as a perfect opportunity to immerse herself in the Washington political scene, get to know national Republican figures, perhaps with an eye to increasing her visibility in the National Party. And it paid off. A member of the Republican National Committee delegation from Vermont from 1936 to 75, she soon became a national figure in the party. First in the women's division, and later when women became integrated, as it were, into the party structure in 1953, she served on a number of national committees. In Washington, she met many of the party leaders, being particularly supportive of New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey in his campaign for the presidency in 1948. And she maintained an extensive correspondence on political issues with Dewey throughout the 1940s. Politically and philosophically, Bailey was by no means a feminist in the present-day sense, nowhere within hailing distance. Indeed, she was deeply conservative in a time when both Republican and Democratic parties were more diverse than they are today. Allied with the more conservative old guard in Vermont, which included governors Mortimer Proctor, Lee Emerson, and Joseph Johnson, she was likewise an ardent supporter of conservative national issues, such as a hardline stance on communism, fiscal conservatism, and so on. Like generations of women had done throughout history, however, She worked to create for herself within the parameters of the status quo an influential and powerful position, in this case, in the Republican Party, not only in the state, but nationally. No unseemly pounding on the doors of male privilege for her. No bra burnings. No polemics. No railing against women's second-class status. And yet, in the context of her times, she was a strong advocate for the advancement of women in the professions and in politics. I think that, like many successful women of her day, she did not so much define herself within her gender as ignore it. She assumed that women could, of course, take roles heretofore reserved for men. Gender wasn't the key to success. Ability and hard work were, and those she had in abundance. Thus, when she supported an equal rights amendment in 1950s, it was not because she saw women as struggling against the tyranny of male privilege, but because it did not occur to her that women should be anything but equal. But it's not, you understand, that Bailey didn't chafe at being relegated to auxiliary status in the party and in Senator Gibson's office. At times, she certainly did. In her autobiography, she writes of her secretarial job with Gibson that, quote, after a tenure of 6 years in the position, I was still just a secretary, end quote. But, and here's the important thing for her, quote, as a mother monkey once said to her offspring, evolve and evolve, my dears, and someday you may be professors at Yale, end quote. You see, there was a purpose in her being in this subordinate position. Bailey also maintained lifelong contacts with other women professionals whom she met as a lawyer and as a politician. For example, Shirley Farr and Marion Martin, who were members of the Vermont Republican Committee and legislators, U.S. Senator Claire Booth Luce, and Wilma Steele Williams, the Franklin County Probate Court judge, just to name a few. And keenly aware of her position as a role model for younger women in the political and legal arenas, she spent countless hours speaking to young women at schools and youth organizations, both in the state and across the country, urging them to take part in the responsibilities of being a good citizen. Much of her work is done in the auspices of the Women's Division of the Republican National Committee. They concentrated on supporting Republican women candidates for office and on the development of women's roles in the party in general. And from 1952 to 56, she served as vice chair of the Republican National Party, a position that at that time was reserved for women. After a long hiatus, in 1950, Bailey resumed her career in public office in earnest. Running for the Vermont House as representative from South Burlington, she demonstrated her brilliance as a campaigner, using what she called her friends and neighbors approach. This involved an indefatigable effort to meet with every voter in her district, knocking literally on the door of nearly every prospective constituent in the city. This personal contact with the voters allowed her to demonstrate her unique qualities and convince doubters that her sex was not a hindrance to her potential as a legislator. Not only was she a farmer and from a farming family, and in those days that really meant a lot, that was really an important aspect of her, but she had been a teacher, another respected profession, and as a lawyer, she was a member of the educated elite in Vermont. And it worked, both then and in her bid for lieutenant governor in 1954. Then she crisscrossed the state in a highly effective effort to introduce herself personally to the voters. Bailey was elected to 2 terms in the legislature, and in her second term, she ran a successful campaign for one of the most influential offices in the state, that of Speaker of the House. Once again, her approach to campaigning won the day. A tireless effort to talk with every member of the legislature, and particularly the women, who made up a sizable minority of the General Assembly that year. One of them, newly elected Representative Gertrude Mallory of Fairleigh, and a member of a prominent political Vermont family, as we all know, related in an interview by Alicia Freitag and cited in Freitag's master's thesis, which is a biography of Bailey, about how Bailey came to visit and garner her support. Although Mallory was not confident that she could win, she thought Bailey's campaign, quote, sounded reasonable, end quote, and she was persuaded to second her nomination. It was Bailey's first political success in a statewide office. And personally, I believe that Bailey viewed this as her greatest achievement, not the lieutenant governorship. Because the legislature at this time was and had been for many years controlled by the Vermont Republican Party, she was running against powerful members of her own party. During her single term as lieutenant governor, Bailey did, like many holders of that office, not effect very many changes in Vermont government and policy. Her term is more noted for the inter-party conflicts between the so-called old guard and the more liberal Aiken Gibson wing, Gibson Jr., that is. Notably, as a member of the old guard contingent, she was opposed to Rutland County Senator Asa Bloomer's being chosen as president of the Senate pro tem, a position which he lost on a tie vote broken by outgoing Lieutenant Governor Joseph Johnson of the old guard. Bailey did not run for governor in 1956, nor even for a second term as lieutenant governor, publicly stating that she needed to retire from politics to care for her husband ill with Parkinson's disease. But privately, as Selina has said, she was said to have felt that it was not time for a woman governor. At the time, the incumbent was Joseph B. Johnson, and with the Vermont tradition of two-term governors, it would not have been a good time to challenge him. And in 1958, running for governor would have placed her at odds with another Vermont political tradition, the Mountain Rule. There was a long-standing gentleman's agreement that the highest political offices would alternate between candidates from eastern Vermont and western Vermont. And in 1958, it would have been the turn of eastern Vermont. So why did she not run for a congressional seat? It would have seemed that her experience in the state and in the national party would have indicated an aspiration to national office. Her public justification was that she would have had to leave her ill husband behind in Vermont for months on end. But she had had full-time support from her sister, Frederica, for many years at this point, Frederica had put her career on hold in order that her sister could pursue her career in politics. Maybe her opposition to the rising, more liberal wing of the party at that time decreased her influence in the state. This is a guess. I hope somebody will comment on this. But, I'd like to hear from you in the audience about what your thoughts are on this. Bailey certainly did continue her post as National Committee woman from Vermont until close to her death in 1976. And in that capacity, she continued to work for Republican causes and advocate for an increased share of leadership roles for women, both statewide and nationally. Before I finish that evening, I too would like to put in a brief plug for our research collections, particularly the Bailey papers. This is not a collection just of Bailey's papers, but of her family's as well. Clearly, it's a rich source for the study of Vermont politics and government in the middle third of the 20th century, and for women in politics at that time, but it's much more than that. Bailey and her family retained a close relationship with one another over their long lives. Their correspondence, which stretches from Bailey's grandparents' generation in the mid-19th century to the 1990s, is a source for the study of Vermont families, rural middle-class life, women's organizations, and a host of other related topics. So how should one then sum up Consuelo Northrop Bailey's accomplishments in her life? It is clear to me that one of her lasting contributions was that she fostered and encouraged other women to take part in society as full and equal participants. She believed that her position in public life and public office placed upon her the responsibility to be a mentor and supporter for women newly on their way in those fields. As for myself, I think her own words are most enlightening in this regard. In her inaugural speech as Speaker of the House, she alluded to the Vermont Constitution, which stated that, quote, all men are created equally free and independent, end quote. Those words, she concluded, and I quote, will take on a brighter, more complete meaning for the women, not only of this House, but also of the women in Vermont. Thank you. So, is any speculation on her failure to run for national office? I certainly would be interested in hearing what people would say on that. Sam? Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was fascinated that no woman has been elected to the U.S. House or Senate from Vermont, and
Never.
that's really remarkable in spite of all of the women who've served in public office. And I wondered if you could speculate, and Selena maybe, a little more about why that might have been the case.
Well, like Selena, I think it's a question that needs to be investigated. It's clear that Consuelo Bailey was not the only woman who did not get to Congress. So maybe the issue is not her personality, her place as in politics at that time. It may be a bigger issue. But I don't know. I'd love to see somebody dive into that one.
Do you think that if the Republican Party stood behind her when she was lieutenant governor, do you think she would have been elected governor?
I don't know. There were impediments to the traditions of Vermont politics, in Vermont politics at that time, you know. The first time, the 1956 election, Johnson was still the incumbent and was expected he'd go for 2 terms. And then in 58, she was from the West and not from the East. So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, but in '58, wasn't Stafford elected? He's from the West.
Well, things.
You got these sides, but
Yeah, what?
the sides are not exactly right.
You mean East or West?
No, I'm talking about the years.
Oh, okay.
Johnson's elected from the east in,
54.
and then again a lead from the east in 56.
Okay.
So it's from the west in 58.
West of 58. Oh, okay.
So throw that one out, Sylvia. Throw that one out.
All right, I'll throw it out. So,
Of course, we have had women run. Jan Backus, for instance, challenged Senator Jeffers and did a very good job. She wasn't able to win, but she ran a very good campaign.
mhm.
So perhaps it's something that has to happen in increments. Perhaps women have to challenge and keep challenging.
Keep at it.
Well, I would say, first of all, we only have 1 congressman. Most other states have more congressmen, so they have more opportunity for more offices. And then I would say, the power of incumbency. If you look at our delegation, they've been there for years, and they can be there as long as they want.
Mm-hmm.
So male or female, it's very hard to be an incumbent these days. Didn't used to be that way. But very hard to open the door for any newcomer, including women. I think a woman, if she ran, would have an equal chance to get elected as a man for an open seat.
In this day and age.
I think we'll probably see that in the next couple of years.
Mhm.
Hopefully.
Sylvia, I really enjoyed your talk, and Selena's as well. It was my understanding that Consuelo Northrop Bailey played a key role in opening the door for Bob Stafford to get elected governor. I believe I read that she withheld her announcement until she first confided in him that that was her decision, giving him an opportunity to make contact with all the key people and line up his support. And then she made her announcement, and at that point, he had it locked up, the nomination. Because since it was inevitable that a Republican would be elected because we were a one-party state, the competition was, of course, within the party. So she really helped him in his career, and of course, you know, he went on to national office.
What was the question? I'm sorry. Or did you just?
Well, we had been, I guess it wasn't really a question, but it was a sequel to a conversation that took place 2 questions ago. So, if that's all right.
Oh, yes, thank you.
It's a comment. Okay.
I'd like to bring up the issue of gender that both of you brought up. And Madeleine, you have one of the most favorite quotes I have about being a woman politician in your autobiography. When you write about walking into a room and there's this pause, and everybody pauses for this moment when they try to figure out who you are. Because you're a woman, but you're a politician. But you're a woman politician. But women are politicians. And you write that about your career and something that you experience. And I think about that a lot with someone like Consuelo Northrop Bailey. I think gender mattered to her a lot. And I think that she knew that. How could she not know that? She can't not have gender. She can't not be a woman. She can't not have womanhood, because men have manhood. They're doing that in politics all the time. And I'm just wondering if we maybe could talk about that in her time, what that might have meant with the choices that she's making, including those very important choices around being a wife of a man who is disabled, a man who has Parkinson's. Anybody? I mean, I'm just really curious about what that means, about what that could tell us about her as a woman politician. Someone who is practicing politics in this state. I'm very curious about that.
Well, she wasn't publicly vocal about the issues of gender and discrimination on the basis of gender.
I don't mean discrimination, I mean displaying gender. She actually would pose for newspapers and magazines, polishing her little notch keys in her, her glasses and stuff. She would be in an apron in her home. That's displaying gender. I'm a housewife. She wasn't always in a 3-piece suit as a lawyer and a politician. She presented herself as a woman, as a wife, and a mother, as well as a politician and a lawyer.
She wasn't a mother, that's the only thing.
Oh, but, yeah, sorry. Actually, a lot of women who displayed themselves as mothers were not mothers.
That's true.
Jane Addams being the most famous.
Right. Well, I suspect, I'm just guessing because we can't get inside her head if she didn't write any of this down. But it wasn't acceptable to articulate those ideas in her time. But she must have caused a sensation.
Yeah.
Especially as the first state's attorney, and maybe it was her conservatism that gave her safety in a way, though she probably genuinely believed it. I don't want to drop your question, but I just also want to ask something. It's related to gender. I mean, my understanding, and I just heard this through the Times, that the vote for Speaker was fragmented, that the women in the House really coalesced around her and probably voted. Do you know if they voted unanimously for her?
I don't think so.
But the other vote was split by about 5 candidates for Speaker. Yeah. So that strategy, I mean, those women, probably none of them would have called themselves feminists, but they supported her as a woman, and that was the winning strategy. Is that what you?
Yes.
discovered?
I think that's certainly true, and I think the fact that, in fact, Gertrude Mallory said that the fact that Consuelo Bailey came and spoke to her personally and tried to persuade her personally was the factor in her decision. She said she might have...
But that's what every candidate for speaker does. I mean, that's what Gay Simonton did. That's what, they all visit all the legislators. Maybe she was the first to do it, I don't know, but certainly that's the practice now, to do that. So I think it must have been something more than the personal touch. It must have been the women's bonding to some extent.
One would like to think so, yes.
That's also true for the nomination for lieutenant governor. She ran against two men, and that split the vote. But let me say something else about the polishing the furniture and playing the piano. In her book herself, she says these were the only times she did it.
I want to follow up on that too and just say that I think one of my favorite parts of the Bailey collection is the photograph collection, and there is a huge collection of sort of family, really informal family photographs of herself and her sisters and her husband kind of hanging out on the family farm, and then there are those formal portraits, some of those formal portraits that you mentioned, and it's really interesting, the difference, just to look at, I mean, it would be really interesting just to do a study of that, I think. And there's rich material in that collection.
To go back to your point about women not having been elected for national office from Vermont, I think it would be interesting to see how many women have run for or attempted to, or maybe there was only one effort to run for national office. But it would be interesting to study the pattern of why they did not win, because it does seem to me that when I've seen women lose politically here in this state, there seems to be a more vicious backlash toward women who err in some way, offend, than toward men who offend. I mean, I'm not a rabid feminist or anything, but it does seem like, as I'm sitting here recalling some of the ways in which women lost politically, was really, the press was rougher, well, very rough on the women. Maybe it's just my feminine sensitivities there. But the other question I had was, you said something about the liberal Republican wing. Did I understand you correctly to say that that was something that may have alienated her to some extent?
Well, I was speculating on that. It was on the rise at that time. The old guard, as they call themselves, were beginning to recede in influence. Perhaps the fact that she was old guard had an influence on.
Has there been anything written on that particular trend, the rise of the liberal aspect of the Republican Party, and has she been mentioned in there?
I don't think that's a fair question, because to assume that there was a rise of a liberal, that the Republican Party wasn't itself liberal from, and liberal, it held, it was a large tent that held both liberal and conservative elements almost from the time of its birth.
But Sylvia's point.
Yeah. One of the things which I was going to suggest is, though I haven't seen it printed, she was alleged to have offended the Gibsons in some way when she worked.
Gibson Jr. or Sr.?
Yeah, well, the Gibson family. And they were never supportive and always unhappy.
Well, they were fine.
They were, yes. And she had trouble as lieutenant governor. She almost was unable to control the appointments within the Senate when she became lieutenant governor because of resistance.
Just thought it would be of interest to mention another woman politician who did seek national office, and it was Republican Chittenden County Senator Susan Sweetser, and she challenged Bernie Sanders. So, and the primary reason that she lost, well, certainly wasn't because she was a woman. I don't think anyone
still matters. But gender still matters. You can't discount gender. Gender still matters. He has gender, she has gender, politics is gender, it still matters. You still have to take it into account. It might not be the primary reason for why people vote in certain ways, but it still matters. It's still worthy of investigation.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's still worthy of investigation, I think, when someone like Consuela, who is in a very specific historical time period.
Did she have any particular interest during her career in what we might think of as women's issues, education of children and those sort of things?
She was active in many women's organizations.
Will you repeat the question, Sylvia?
Did she have any particular interest in certain women's issues, like education?
Traditional, what we think of as women's issues, such as education and childhood issues, and perhaps labor laws and those sort of things. Did she have any initiatives while she was in power?
Well, she was. She didn't have a lot of major initiatives. I don't think. I mean, the oleomargarine bill.
Are you casting aspersions on the oleomargarine bill? Defensive butter.
Maybe I'll pass that one on to Sam. The question was whether what Consuelo Bailey's interests were in regards to what we would see as women's issues.
You know, I was going to use the term housekeeping in terms of the legislature, but I don't mean, policy things. I mean, she was concerned with the organization. She was concerned with seeing things that ran properly according to her thoughts. And this is where she seemed, at least in my judgment, where she seemed to expend her efforts. And she writes a book, she writes about, the organizations, the owls. She takes great pride in the legislature. It's that sort of thing that really keeps her going, rather than any issues per se. She doesn't seem to be issue-oriented at all.
Yeah, certainly not on the state level.
And even when she is, like someone mentioned oleomargarine, that was a woman's issue, but it was Bernice Bromley. It wasn't.
I didn't donate it.
Huh?
I didn't donate it.
No, actually,
Actually, Sylvia.
Sylvia did.
I'm interested too, and I think this idea of looking at sort of like a small local community of politicians is a great sort of test bed for that, and sort of how do we construct this idea of women's issues, and yes, it's an interesting question, and that was one of the questions that came up just as I was researching the grant was sort of how we put that together, and if people naturally gravitate to some of these issues like health and education, social welfare, or if people maybe in some instances also get kind of like pushed into those issues. And
I think what I would say from my own experience with her papers is that her primary goal was to foster women in professions and in political careers. If that is that's kind of a basic women's issue, that women get more say in governance and policy. So yes, in that sense, she had an interest in women's issues.
This is really off the wall, but a big opponent in the Senate was Asa Bloomer, who represents the so-called liberal element, and she, the more conservative element, and yet subsequently it becomes apparent that Asa Bloomer is an ardent anti-feminist. This becomes very obvious over the reapportionment thing. So it's really much more complicated than.
Yeah.
I have a question, I don't know how to formulate it, but
die that way.
Well, I have heard people who knew her say that she was a, quote, tough old bird, end quote. Yeah, I think she was a pretty strong personality.
Thank you.
Although I have to say, having looked at the collection, in her personal papers and her family papers, there's a really different side of her that comes out, I think, that's kind of much more vulnerable, and it's interesting to kind of compare those two personas.
Sylvia, to what extent was she influenced by her mother, in the sense that, as you pointed out, her mother, took the children to the Burlington area, leaving the farm? That must have been very unusual at that point in time, to live apart in order to provide a higher quality education to your children. So, to what extent was she really influenced by her mother? I mean, she went on to law school and so on.
I think very much so. I'm sure that both parents were equally dedicated to educating their children. Her mother was a teacher, and their correspondence after she left home is intense and personal, and they retain close contact with each other throughout life.
Sometimes editors are wonderful things. I did an article in which I mentioned her, and the editor kept sending back and changed Consuelo to Consuela, which is an interesting question. Why is she Consuelo?
Well, I've heard from people who knew her that that's how she pronounced it.
But that's a myth. I mean, shouldn't the family name that? That would be a, oh.
When did she spend in her family? She the eldest of the family?
She was a middle sister.
Oh.
That, by the way, is another research value to the collection, I think, is that she was one of three sisters, and they all had different lives. She was the politician, the one out in the world. Her older sister married, had a family. Her younger sister sort of took the Martha role, although not with her own parents, but with Consuelo's husband, and keeping her career on hold until while her sister went, off to work, as it were. I think that's a fascinating thing. We've got another collection with three sisters in it. Very similar situation. I'd love to have somebody study sisters in families and their interactions with each other.
I just wanted to note that this year also, in regard to women in politics, this is the first time ever women have held all leadership positions in the Vermont House. Gay Simonton being the speaker, Carolyn Partridge being the majority leader, and Peg Flory being minority leader, which is really exciting to see.
Progress. On to Congress.